Welcome. It's great to see so many people interested in this book talk. I'd like to welcome you all. Special welcome to Professor Jeffrey Ding. Thank you for coming. We're very, very honored to have you. Author of Technology and the Rise of Great Powers. These book talk events is a way for us to bring different influential voices on technology on the stage, so that we can get different inputs to challenge also our own thinking. So really, how the next generation of technology will impact our world. And I think this book is probably the most important book last year on these issues. At least that's our president agrees with. And we were lucky to meet each other already in Seattle last year. And I read your book, and I also listened to the podcast you did with Brad Smith that I found very, very interesting. I think Jeffrey's book is really essential reading in the context of the rise of AI technology. And it offers important lessons from history on how Europe can boost its competitiveness with the use of technology. And how do we do this? And there's a lot of discussions in Europe about how we're lagging behind and how we are not, we're lagging behind on competition, how we can be more competitive. And I think here we at least have one idea of what we can do. And we had a roundtable earlier today, and I understood that it's not too late. So I thought that was very encouraging, because here in Brussels we have a tendency to talk about the problems and how we're lagging behind, and we don't have this and we don't have that. So I think that's going to be very interesting change to hear about some of the opportunities for Europe and what Europe can do. You're talking a lot about single-purpose technology and general-purpose technology, and just because, just half a year ago, this was for me foreign words. I didn't understand what it meant. So I thought I would just say, how I understand it. So single-purpose technology is a technology that really can do one thing and do one thing well. So, for example, a lawn cutter can cut the grass very well, but cannot do so many other things. Whereas the general-purpose technology is a technology that can do various things and can infuse across the economy, like, for example, electricity. You can build a lot of other innovation on top of that, and you can infuse it in different areas of your economy. And Jeffrey Ding is explaining this much better than me, but I just thought it was a nice context to set. And you explore in your book how some countries were historically more successful than others in adapting and embracing new technologies at scale, and argue that the focus on broad diffusion and adoption of general-purpose technologies across the entire economy, those are the most successful countries over time. So really, it's not so important who invented the technology. It's not so important who brings the fundamental infrastructure for the technology. In the case of electricity, the power plants. In the case of AI, the next general purpose technology, or the data centers. But really, which countries are able to diffuse and adopt that technology. That's at least my reading of your book. And that's also in the competitive compass spelled out, that we really need to focus on diffusion and adoption. Europe is behind. I think von der Leyen said 14% of companies in Europe have adopted AI technology. In the US, it's 50%. She said that in China, it's 75%. I don't know if you can confirm that. But we have work to do on diffusion and adoption. And Another very, very important lesson from your book, I think, is how important skilling in literacy is. And I think, there has been some nice initiative by the European Union, this Union of Skills announcement last week. I think it's very interesting. Now we'll have to see how ambitious this is. In our roundtable just before, we also talked about that a lot of the skilling is national, so what can we do on a European basis? That's yet to be seen, but I think it's very, very important that we in Europe understand how important the skilling piece is as well. So not enough about my views. Looking very much forward to hearing your thoughts and also how Europe can be on the forefront and of this new AI-led technological revolution, and also learning from the past. So thank you for being here, and I will hand over to our moderator tonight, journalist Silke Wettak. Thank you for being here as well, and welcome to the stage. Thank you.
I love the most important message, which has got, it's not too late. It's always well received in Brussels. I don't think book talks around here very often start with a quote from an artist. I'd like to do that anyway. Eileen Gray, the inventor of the table, you might know her, she's a designer of Irish descent. She said, "To create, one must first question everything. Never adapt someone else's conclusions without putting it to the test of your own reasoning and imagination." When I read that, I thought it is so apt because it really describes what you have done in your book. You have single-handedly questioned I would say, conventional thought really on innovation and the power play, the global power play. You say this is not about innovation, it's not about a first move advantage, it's about diffusion. So just a couple of words on your background, because I would like to ask you how you came up with your ideas, and I think for that it's quite important for our audience to know who you are. So at the moment you're an assistant professor of political science at the George Washington University. Previously, you were a postdoc fellow at the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation. You got your PhD from Oxford, and you were actually born in China and moved to Iowa when you were 3. And your dad came to Iowa to study computer sciences. And I think that's quite important for your background. So how did you come up with this idea to question conventional thought on innovation?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Silke. Thanks for taking the time to moderate this discussion and for that generous introduction. Thank you as well, Nana Luis, for setting the table for this discussion. I think the conventional wisdom in terms of how do technological revolutions affect the rise and fall of great powers? That's the central question my book tackles. The conventional wisdom is very much, it's about which country can monopolize innovation, which is pioneering or first commercializing a new technology. It was very much about which country can monopolize innovation in leading sectors. These new fast-growing industries that can oftentimes become the largest in an economy that grow off the back of new technological innovations. And so think electric vehicles today, or in the past, cotton textiles in the first industrial revolution, or the chemical sector in the second industrial revolution. And so as I was trying to understand this, the initial motivation was I was interested in US-China competition in emerging technologies and artificial intelligence. And so the initial motivation was, as I was going back through all these past industrial revolutions and reading the work of economic historians of technology, this idea is not new to me. I don't view myself as an innovator in this space. I view myself very much as an adapter or adopter in this space. Their work was showing actually what happened in these industrial revolutions was the countries that came out ahead were those that were able to diffuse and adopt these general purpose technologies at scale. So in the Industrial Revolution, for Britain, it wasn't just about cotton textile exports. In fact, Britain's growth trajectory came when it was able to industrialize and spread iron machinery advances across its entire economy. In the US, in the Second Industrial Revolution, it wasn't about the US exporting more chemical dyestuffs or new synthetic dyestuffs. In fact, the best and the brightest in the US were going to Germany to study chemistry, PhDs. It was about the US's ability to adopt general purpose technologies and machine tools and interchangeable parts manufacturing at scale. And so that was really the motivation for developing this different theory about general purpose technology diffusion. It was reading all of these historical accounts and finding that the data didn't match up to the received wisdom.
So you were basically connecting the dots. You said you're not an innovator, but you made a connection no one else had made before.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I don't know. I don't know if any ideas are really that new. I think a lot of people have been saying versions of these things. A lot of the work of academics is we say things that are obvious, but we try to write it in a way that's pretty clear, and maybe we give like a new label to a term like diffusion, when really I could have just gone with adoption. That's I'll take some credit on that perspective, but yeah, I think a lot of these ideas have been around for a long time, but hopefully the book does something in the way of packaging them in an effective way.
How come we have been so attached to the other way of seeing it? I think especially when you look at politicians. I mean, Joe Biden, when he was president, he said, under my watch, China is not going to overtake us. And he very much implied that he was sort of referring to the other model.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you look at President Biden's very first speech to Congress, he used that exact quote, and he pointed to the U.S. needs to dominate innovation and pioneering new fundamental breakthroughs in new industries. And I'm not saying that's not a good thing. I'm just saying it's not the only thing that matters. And actually, in a lot of these historical cases, it wasn't necessary, right? The U.S. was not the innovation leader in the Second Industrial Revolution. Innovation leadership was very contested between the US, Britain, and Germany across all these different other technologies. The British Institute of Electric Engineers has this report where they say on areas of inventive genius, the UK is not behind in electrical science. It's about practical application across all these different industries. Why do I think we gravitate towards that eureka moment or focusing only on which country can pioneer fundamental breakthroughs? I think some of it is a cultural predisposition towards like valorizing the technologists, right? We don't put maintainers or engineers on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal or Der Spiegel. We put the technologists, the heroic inventors. Sort of that's a societal mold that we've attached there. And David Egerton, who's a historian of technology at Imperial College, I believe, he calls this bias towards innovation centrism. So I think that's one part of the explanation there.
We like geniuses. We like glamorous stories. You know, Silicon Valley is also in a way is about certain people that are not like everyone else.
Yeah.
What kind of feedback have you got for your book? I know Brad Smith, he bought 600 copies of the book. I imagine a couple of copies have been circulating around here. That's how people around here got the idea to invite you here in the first place. But how have people reacted to your findings in the US?
Yeah, I think in the US what's interesting is I get a chance to brief and regularly talk with US policymakers who are influencing tech policy, and their usual rebuttal is to say that what is happening in AI is different from what happened in previous general purpose technologies and previous industrial revolutions. So I guess one of the key findings from my book is that general purpose technologies, they take a really long time to make their mark, to diffuse throughout the entire economy. So from the pioneering of the electric dynamo, 1870s, to when the US received large-scale productivity boosts from electrification, that was a process that spanned more than 4 decades. And so for me, the time frame really matters on that front, in that it's about making investments in cultivating a wide base of engineering skills, which is the main institutional and policy suggestion that I give, that pay off 5 years, 10 years, multiple decades down the line. And the pushback I get from the US, for them, they see, at least a camp of US technology policy makers sees AI as a transformed technology that will make its mark within the next year or 2 years. And that's connected to visions of transformative AI, maybe super intelligence. And so I think that's guiding a lot of the US's Protect Fortress America type of strategy. Whereas, for example, things like the export chip controls, if you're thinking this is a competition about who can adopt GPTs at scale over the course of multiple decades, trying to maintain a hold on the crown jewels or using export controls to deny advanced computing capabilities to China, for instance, that's a policy of we need to protect our brief 2-year window. In 20 years and 10 years, we don't even know what chips are going to be the most important. It's likely NVIDIA's monopoly will fade in some ways. And there's a lot of reasons export controls could backfire. So that's usually the pushback I get, is you are discounting the transformative potential of AI. We're going to get super intelligence in 2 years, and it's going to come with a decisive military capability that we need to prevent. We need to make sure only is contained within the US.
That being said, politicians always like to have an impact during their term. So they don't really like to think in decades. Would you expect the time frame to be the same in AI? Because it is a disruptive technology. Are we talking about 40 years, 50 years, like in electricity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it goes back to Nana Luisa's opening remarks, where she's citing adoption rate numbers, right? On this idea that China has a 70% adoption rate of AI, I just find that so hard to believe in terms of what we know with the past record of how slowly GPTs diffuse. I would bet that data, not knowing the source of that data, I would bet these 70% figures, even a 15% figure or a 50% figure for the US, I would bet that's like survey responses of companies saying they've tried ChatGPT once or something. And no one's gonna say, no, we didn't adopt AI, at least in this current moment. So I think there's a huge gap between playing around with DeepSeek, playing around with Mistral, playing around with ChatGPT, and intensive adoption that actually makes a difference for productivity purposes. So for me, I do think the lessons of history will hold, but I wouldn't say like I'm dogmatic about it. I think like both the inside view and the outside view matter here. So the inside view is you have a lot of people from within the tech companies, from within the AI labs saying, look, this stuff is transformative. You don't know what's gonna come out with the next model. We're gonna get to some sort of super intelligent, transformative AI capability within the next 2 years. And they're drawing on, in some ways, some insider data. And so we should acknowledge that there's some credibility there. We should also acknowledge there's always an incentive to hype up your own capabilities. I'm coming at it from an external outside view, right? I don't have a technical background. I'm looking at if AI is similar to other general purpose technologies, here's what the lessons we can learn from history. I think we should have a mix of both views. My main takeaway is we're overly influenced by the inside view at this point. And so I hope that this book injects more balance to the debate.
How soon would you expect your hypothesis to be verified or falsified?
Yeah, so it's hard to date the arrival of a GPT and then when we see effective diffusion of a GPT to make a meaningful impact on economic productivity at the national level. One indicator I like to use is you date the arrival of a GPT by the point where it reaches 1% adoption in the median sector. And then you date the GPT makes its mark date as a point when it has been adopted by 50%. It's reached 50% adoption rate in the median sector. So the median sector is all the different possible sectors that could adopt the GPT, from most likely to least likely. The median sector would be in the middle. And running that exercise for past industrial revolutions, usually it is going to be longer than 3 decades, even with the computer, which we would expect to diffuse pretty quickly. So for me, like, one way to frame the arrival date for AI is with the AlexNet submission to Stanford's ImageNet competition that really brought forth this new deep learning paradigm. So that took place in 2012. And so if you track it to be multiple decades, 3 decades, at least in the book I say after 2030 is going to be where you see some of these main economic impacts from AI arriving.
Something that really struck me reading the book was the data on Chinese productivity.
Yeah.
Because, it's really, really striking. You mention when we look at the period from 2000 to 2017, total factor productivity in China never surpassed 43% of US total factor productivity, and labor productivity was even running at 30% of the US. Why aren't we talking more about that?
Yeah, I think the crucial dependent variable of the book, the outcome that the book is trying to explain, is the rise and fall of great powers. The more specific expression of that is productivity leadership. The book opens up with a quote from Chinese leader Xi Jinping at the BRICS summit, summit of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS summit on the fourth industrial revolution, where he references past industrial revolutions and how they shifted which country achieved productivity leadership. And so we know from the history of the rise and fall of great powers, Britain becomes the economic leader first because it's the most productive economy. Then the US surpasses Britain in economic efficiency, economic productivity before World War I, and takes on that mantle of global leadership. And so for Chinese leaders, Chinese policymakers, they really do focus on economic productivity because they see that as historically a key determinant in the rise and fall of great powers. And so in the book, that's the key outcome I'm tracking, is for all these different industrial revolutions, how did one country take advantage of these general purpose technologies and become the productivity leader? It's interesting you mentioned those statistics for China, because in the third industrial revolution, in US-Japan competition over information and communications technologies, Japan starts out as a very low level, about like 30%, 40% of the US in total factor productivity, but eventually gets very close, gets to like 90, 95% of US total factor productivity. And there's all this talk about Japan becoming the #1 technological power. In the end, Japan never surpasses the US in total factor productivity, in part, I argue, because it did not adopt computerization as effectively as US, the crucial general purpose technology of that era. So that's why we care about China's productivity rates today, is there's a lot of hype about China is going to overtake the US and become the technological leader. For me, the crucial question is, to what extent can China take advantage of a general purpose technology like AI and boost its productivity growth? As other growth dividends fade, like the demographic dividend is fading, China can only move so many people into cities, urbanization benefits are going to fade. What's going to be that sustainable growth driver? It's adopting new technologies, and general purpose technologies like AI are at the center of that.
And you mentioned that the links between academia and companies in China are probably not ideal for diffusion.
Yeah, there's a few different indicators that I use to answer the question of whether the US or China is better positioned to adopt a GPT like AI at scale. And so one of those indicators is, how well do different parts of your science and technology ecosystem talk with each other and communicate with each other? Are your implementers talking with your innovators? Are your universities talking with your firms and your startups? And so the linkages there is measured by how many AI publications are co-authored by at least one researcher from industry and at least one researcher from academia. So that's a hybridization rate, and the US leads the world in that metric. China is about half the US's rate on that metric. So that's one indicator. Another indicator is how many universities in your country meet a very low quality baseline for being able to train average AI engineers. So I'm not talking about the engineers at OpenAI or at DeepSeek. I'm talking about the ones that are going to be implementing large language models or computer vision models in all these different application sectors. And so the indicator I use there are the universities that have at least just one researcher affiliated with them that has published in an established AI conference. And so China has 29 of those universities. The US has 159. And so once you get past the top tier, the Peking universities, the Tsinghua universities in China, the US by comparison has this broader and deeper bench of universities. So those are a few indicators I use to demonstrate the case for a US advantage in GPT diffusion.
What about Europe? Let's talk about Europe, because Europe has been lagging the US on productivity growth.
Yeah.
The Draghi report mentions AI, and the Draghi report actually states that the slow adoption of digital technology has been the main factor, and that explains why Europe has been lagging behind. I know you've been talking about Europe today, but what's your view, given what you've been researching? And we've just heard it, apparently it's not too late. So tell us more about this.
Well, I think what struck me about the Draghi report and the Commission's Competitiveness Compass readout, and I do want to say, I am coming at this from being my expertise is mostly on the US and the Chinese AI ecosystem. So I know there's a lot of expertise in this room and love to hear everyone's feedback in the comments to follow and the questions to follow. I would say what struck me about those readouts, the Draghi report and the Competitiveness Compass, was this attributing productivity slowdown or a productivity lag to adoption of digital technologies. But I thought what was interesting about the causes of that adoption was not in the leading companies, was not in the European giants or the European leaders not adopting digital technologies. It was that there was too much of a gap between the frontier firms and the small and medium-sized businesses. And so for me, I think it's important to have these conversations about why does Europe not have its own tech giants? And we'll get into the sovereignty and the dependence part of that. But I think at least if you're trying to maximize for productivity growth and long-term economic growth, and I think that's the most crucial determinant of power, history and scholarship has borne that out. Of course, there are other factors that matter for national power. But if you're trying to maximize for that, then it's about what are the policies to bridge the gap between frontier firm adoption of AI and small, medium-sized firm adoption of AI across all of Europe.
And what are they?
Well, I think some of the policies that I draw out for the U.S. context, for example, how do you broaden the base of AI engineering talent, providing alternative pathways to training that talent through investing in community colleges? Some of those would translate to Europe, right? Maybe instead of community colleges, Europe has a lot of like vocational education institutions that could fulfill that alternative pathway route. And broadening the base of engineering skills would make sense there. I think from a comparative perspective, right now, the US is shooting itself in the foot with education policy, essentially treating higher education institutions as the enemy. So there's an opportunity there for Europe to just not do what the US is doing in that space. Could be one thing.
I was actually thinking about Ireland, reading your book. I've spent time in Ireland, and I think the Irish have done a great job when it came to, community colleges, just broadening a base and, like down the country, sort of opening up regional colleges. So it really sort of seems to work very well. I'm going to open the floor soon enough. Just a couple of more questions. So I mean, education is something that's really, really important in Europe. Any specific advice you could give, like more?
I think so. I thought the plank that I highlighted in my notes from the Draghi report was how to harmonize skills certification across the EU. That resonated with me in terms of we've seen in past industrial revolutions that standardization played an important role, not necessarily getting your technology standardized in international technical standard setting forums, which is oftentimes what we talk about when we talk about the geopolitics of standards, but domestic standardization. So how to in the second industrial revolution with machine tools, how to make sure everyone agreed this is the right number of screw threads that we can use. And that helps diffuse technology and ideas and skills throughout a country or throughout a supranational entity. And so that would be one specific plank that resonated with me. What would skills certification look like in the context of AI engineering skills? And how could, at the commission level, what would that look like? Because I know most of human capital policy in Europe is made at the nation state level. And so that would be one thing that the commission would have agency over.
I'm not sure to what extent you're familiar with the AI Act, because I mean, part of that idea was to have uniform regulation, but lots of people in the EU are saying we're shooting ourselves on the foot because we're actually stopping, we're preventing innovation, we're regulating too much. Is there anything you would like to add on that?
I think I'll make 2 points there. I think one is EU AI Act, we haven't seen the full-fledged implementation yet, so it's too early to tell. I think one interesting thing to do would be to look at what was the effect of GDPR on innovation and adoption of different technologies, digital technologies in the EU. I haven't seen a clear-cut, like rigorous test of that. Carnegie International Endowment for Peace had a report that said the one danger from GDPR, or one of the dangers from GDPR, is if it's overly strict and vague, it's harder actually for the small, medium-sized enterprises that sort of the book cares more about to adopt and comply than it would be for the Microsofts of the world, for instance. I think the second thing I would say there is timelines matter here. If this is a marathon of competing in AI over multiple decades, there's a case to be made that prudent regulation that ensures safe and trustworthy AI systems is going to be beneficial in the long run. I think we've seen the negative case of that with nuclear energy, where if you don't implement safety early on, in the long run, you might slow down adoption of nuclear energy with an accident like 3 Mile Island. So I think the crucial thing would be, can you apply that to AI? What does an AI accident look like? What are the safety risks? Does it have to be different because it's not sectoral like nuclear, it's a general purpose technology? A lot of open questions there, but those would be my 2 main takeaways.
That's actually very encouraging for Europe. You know,
Yeah.
sort of looking at safety could actually encourage innovation, not the other way around.
There's an image of the sun on the book cover. It's a new day. But yeah.
I'm wondering, did you get any feedback from China?
Yeah, so I did a few book talks at Chinese universities. I think for them, they were skeptical about the points that China is slow on the diffusion side of things. But again, the people that I'm talking to are based at elite universities in Beijing, one of the most developed areas in the world, full stop. I'm curious, what does it look like for an innovation to travel from Beijing and Hangzhou and some of these other first-tier cities to a small town in an inland province, let's say like Qinghai in China? And I think it's much harder. That process is much harder and has faced a lot more challenges than in other countries. So they would push back and say, look at how fast China has adopted high-speed rail, or look at how fast China has adopted mobile payments, food delivery apps. And so to that, I would say, on some technologies, this top-down centralized approach, you can almost mandate diffusion of high-speed rail. On some of the consumer-facing stuff, it's relatively costless to adopt. It's an app. Adopting something like cloud computing, adopting something like AI in a business's productivity workflow, that costs something. That almost requires you to have an AI engineer to fine-tune that AI model and apply it within a specific application context. And so for those, I think China struggles more because you can't do that in a planned top-down way.
Any feedback from your dad, who's a computer scientist?
Yeah, so I mean, I think partly we tend to think of academic works as we're just searching for the truth. I think, or like we're coming at this from a view from nowhere. I tend to think that even a somewhat stale academic book is still it's an opinion. It comes from a subjective view, and maybe I landed on this idea that it's about ordinary engineers because my dad has been working as a software engineer for like 30 plus years at the same company. And so it's, I think, his take is interesting. I think he's like pretty critical of the Chinese government, in part because that was one of the reasons he wanted to move to the US. And so I think his take was that in some ways he agreed that the US system is more attuned to diffusing AI at scale.
Okay, now I'm going to open the floor. I presume we've got plenty of questions. We've got a mic. First, the gentleman here. Please keep your questions short and introduce yourself. Oh, there's a mic. Just on the way.
Hello, everybody. I loved your book. I think it was a great book, definitely. I had one question on like export controls, like which you touched upon like quite briefly. And one hunch that I actually had is that like the policy prescription that you have on export controls, like I mean, not you necessarily, but your theory sort of brings could also, on the contrary, be a much more hawkish policy, because like maybe the goal is not only to diffuse. The goal is not only to keep the leading sectors in the US, it's to prevent China from getting access to technologies full stop, in a way. Like it could be, for instance, when you look at like lithography machines, ASML and so on, like maybe like your theory can also lead to a much more stringent policy. So what is your take on that? Like, could it be a logical conclusion that flows from the book or not necessarily?
Could you just let us know who you are?
Oh, sorry.
Name and
I'm
affiliation.
Salih Bora from the Free University of Brussels.
Okay. Yeah, Sally, this is a fascinating question. So let me set the stage a little bit. Right now, US export control policies are targeted towards high-end chips used to train frontier models. So NVIDIA A100s and up. Your question is, if I'm right and it's all about GPT diffusion, it's not just about China being able to train frontier models. Maybe the US should also try to slow down China from implementing large language models and deploying large language models at scale throughout their entire economy. And there are actual conversations about this in the US right now. So expanding the scope of export controls to a chip like the NVIDIA H20, which is used not just to train frontier models, but also used to integrate and deploy large language models. So for example, Tencent, a Chinese social media company, has reportedly purchased hundreds and thousands of these H20 chips to deploy DeepSeek, deploy AI in their system. So I don't think that is a logical conclusion of my argument. I think historically these like control methods have it's really hard to prevent one country from accessing a general purpose technology. Britain employed some of these measures. They try to prevent British engineers skilled in the steam engine or iron machinery and technologies from moving to the European continent. And it's just really hard. It's already so hard to enforce the export controls on such a narrow band of chips. Expanding that to slow down diffusion would be even more difficult to enforce. And it's easier for companies to develop competitive alternatives to things like the H20 than it would be to develop alternatives to the high-end chips. So I think that would be one set of counter arguments. And I think my second point of counter arguments why I don't think that's a smart strategy is once you do more widespread, sort of actually completing that goal might be bad for the US, right? We care about other things beyond just what my book cares about, right? Economically weak or uncertain or unstable China might be more of a threat to US national security than a China with a stable economy, right? There's all this academic evidence about economic interdependence and diversionary war theory that supports that. So that's how I would approach that question.
The gentleman there.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Alexander Strel from the University of Namur and the think tank CER. I think you have a very convincing theory. I just want to ask you two related questions. One is, what are the criteria for diffusion, and do you have a kind of a table ranking the jurisdiction on this? And the second is, do you think it makes sense to analyze that in terms of the US, the EU, and China, or more in a disaggregated form? You know, because I guess some US states are better at doing that, or some Chinese provinces are better at doing that.
Yeah.
Then, so does it make sense to analyze that at such a disaggregate level?
Great questions. So metrics for diffusion, one of my other strands of research is looking at how do you assess the national scientific and technological capabilities of nations using innovation capacity indicators, which is what we overweight on, versus diffusion capacity indicators. So if you just search China's diffusion deficit, you'll find my metrics there. I think one thing that's tough, why it's tough to come up with metrics for diffusion versus like innovation, we can just count publications and patents and R&D funding. It's sort of early pipeline. It's harder to measure diffusion because as I said about the 70% or the 50% figures, sometimes it's reliant on surveys and report. It's hard to look inside the company to see is it actually being efficiently utilized. And it's specific to a particular technology. So we might care a lot more about the diffusion rates of general purpose technologies like AI than the diffusion rate of like a cutting edge pharmaceutical drug, right? That doesn't need to be adopted across all different application sectors of the economy. So some of the ones I'm tracking for AI, for example, would be how many companies have adopted large language models to the extent that they're paying for 1 billion computing tokens a day. And so that's about like 1,000 conversations with a conversation AI agent. And in China, that metric is, I think 200 companies have met that threshold. I haven't done that exercise. It's hard to get that data for other countries, but that still seems like we're in the early stages. You just have 200 early adopters right now. And sure, that number might change, but I think that does speak to diffusion is still slow going and in the early stages now. Sorry, second question. Aggregate, yes. Why do I focus on aggregate productivity? Power, I think for me, I care about power, the rise and fall of great powers. And power is still exercised at the national level. So a lot of people, Silke was asking me about like pushback on my argument. A lot of people will bring up, well, hey, Beijing has these coastal provinces that lead the world in terms of innovation and diffusion. But for me, we've seen in the past that it's about your general economic productivity at the national level. Beijing has to worry about its low productive regions. That presents challenges. It prevents threats to its economic legitimacy. It means it has less resources to convert to military power. And so overall economic growth rates really do matter still at the national level because power matters.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your interesting insights to your book. So as we talk about Europe, we know that more than 90% of European companies are SMEs. And as you mentioned as well, the cost of adoption is quite high. Beyond skilling that you already explored, are there other incentives you would say that either through policy mechanisms or else throughout the economy that can push greater adoption of GPTs for SMEs?
Your affiliation?
Oh, sorry, I'm Cornelia and I'm from Microsoft.
Great. So I think one other strand that I focus on beyond just broadening the base of skills is also making sure that those education institutions are linked to industrial applications. And so one example I like to give from the second industrial revolution is Germany was able to produce enough mechanical engineers, but the mechanical engineering education was not connected to industrial requirements. I looked at like US engineering institutions and German engineering institutions around 1893. And the US ones had much more of their curriculum devoted to exercises in the lab and the shop. And so there were these interconnections, these linkages between industry and academia, between the implementers and the innovators that I was talking about. And so one set of policy prescriptions that resonated with me from the Draghi report was this proposal to substantially boost technology transfer offices across the European Union. And sort of, oftentimes when I talk to Chinese interlocutors and scholars on this issue, they point to the US's really strong protections for university researchers to commercialize their technologies. And so that's one example of how do you build better technology transfer pipelines between the SMEs and the universities, between the startups and the frontier firms, sort of these technology transfer pipelines? Great question.
Hello, thanks very much for the presentation. My name is Ricardo Busico. I'm also from the Free University of Brussels. I started my PhD 1 month later your publication, so I feel particularly attached to the book. I will be very straightforward. I think you make a very compelling argument about the importance of diffusion compared to innovation, but we're also realizing that the origin of the technologies that we diffuse has some importance too. So how do we balance the diffusion of a technology and the geographical origin of that technology?
Yeah, it's a really important point, right? Because the caveat to all of this is this book has a limited purpose, which is if you only care about economic productivity and economic growth differences in the long term, this is the run faster GPT diffusion model that you should adopt. But obviously, countries and supranational entities care about other things beyond just economic productivity. And so over-dependency, technological autonomy, and sovereignty come into play here, and that's why ownership matters, right? If you only cared about the questions my book is concerned about, then it doesn't matter who owns the technology stack. It's just about who can implement it faster. But I do think those concerns are relevant, and the question is, how do you find that right balance? To what extent, in the US, the approach to finding that balance is seeking a small yard of technologies, usually with dual use implications, or for example, the military applications with the DoD's trusted foundry system saying we'll only source semiconductors for military applications from these companies. How do you create a small yard, and what is, it might be you still have ownership from a bunch of different suppliers or different countries as long as it's diversified and you're not overly reliant on one, and sort of it's not concentrated on one. And so to what extent can you balance that with this demands for just like running faster and accelerating GPT diffusion? I think that would be the core question on that front.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Ernesto. I work at the Interface, a think tank focused on tech policy. And I must confess, I haven't read the book. I'm really liking the conversation here. Yeah. And I'm also happy that you look at history. And I was curious about that. I don't know if you covered that in your book or you have an opinion, but what about those instances where the diffused old kind of impedes the diffusion of something new, because there's always vested interests on keeping an industry in a specific way. I don't know if you have any particular opinions about that, because maybe in my view, for example, and I had to get a long discussion on that, but I think that has been played a part in Europe, you know, with the auto industry, for example. Right. There has not been enough diversification, in my opinion, in different types of industries. So yeah, I would just like to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for admitting that you haven't read the book. I feel like most people read the first chapter and then start to get to the middle and skip to the end with the US-China competition chapter. So I appreciate it. I think in terms of vested interests and established interests that prevent diffusion, one example that comes to mind that's interesting is one reason China was able to be so fast in adopting mobile payments, like Alipay, Tencent WeChat Pay, is in part because they didn't have the legacy infrastructure of credit card payment systems. And so in some way, to your point, sometimes the legacy infrastructure will slow down technology adoption. How do you break that apart? It's tough. I think it's a tough challenge that all countries are facing. Like, almost by definition, the GPT diffusion approach I'm advocating, the benefits are diffuse. The benefits are dispersed across all these different interest groups. Whereas vested interests are concentrated interests, established interests, so they can rally around and lobby for protections. And so that's why it's hard to push for GPT diffusion policies, because the benefits are, so sometimes it's almost like a political economy problem there. And I don't necessarily have an answer to how do you stop humans from being selfish. But yeah, and this is kind of this is sometimes what's an issue here is, like, the U.S.'s Chips and Science Act, for example, I thought the science plank was more important because it did invest substantially in STEM workforce development, science and technology, engineering, math development. And part of the reason that was able to pass was because they adopted this competitiveness frame. We need to do this, otherwise we'll lose to China. I think sometimes that's dangerous to feed into in terms of the AI arms race narratives. But unfortunately, sometimes it's almost necessary to get ambitious policy across the table. So it's a tough dilemma.
Gentleman there.
Hello, Henry Kaarakainen from Blick Public Affairs. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation. My question is maybe regarding regulation. There's a lot of talk about the European Union being the powerhouse for regulation and producing red tape and so forth. And so maybe for me, interest is to flip the question towards the United States and China. What's the role of regulation or lack of regulation in, say, boosting or hindering the diffusion of emerging technologies? I don't know if...
It's a great question. I think if I could go back and redo the research for the book, in sort of like one of the Google Doc to-do lists is go back and look at the role of safety regulation in all these past general purpose technologies. Because with the steam engine, you had regular steamboat explosions all the time. And that was obviously slowing down the diffusion of steam-based technologies. With electricity, President Teddy Roosevelt had to install electricity in the White House as sort of a demonstration that this is safe, right? So, and I gave the nuclear example. So I think there's definitely a connection. I haven't compiled the data to sort of give you a fuller answer on that front. To your specific question, what are the US and China doing? I think both are adopting pretty permissive approaches. They're almost more similar to each other than each of them are to the EU at this point. China specifically, the interesting case I'll give is April 2023, China introduces some very restrictive draft regulations on generative AI services. Essentially, if you're going to provide LLM services to the public, you would have to verify the objectivity and accuracy of your training data. So these companies are training on essentially all of the Chinese internet text, right? Or the equivalent of sort of Wikipedia, Baidu Baike. So you imagine you can't bear that, even if you're a big company, let alone if you're a startup. So they had to balance that because they're so concerned about controlling information flows. So that's the area where there is a lot of regulation. But at the end of the day, they had to balance that with, we have to let these companies source their models to the public in order to compete. And so months later, in August 2023, they relaxed those draft regulations. And so that's a specific example where you're starting to see the push and the pull in the Chinese regulatory context. So that would be fruitful ground for further evidence. Good question.
The lady over there.
Hi, thanks so much again, Jeff, for being here. Also, probably from the whole AI governance community on your work on the China AI newsletter. Huge fan. I think my question relates a little bit about, or like, I would be really curious to get your read on current investment announcement, especially with this new theme kind of emerging about tech sovereignty, and like whether you see maybe some lessons from history, maybe also some cautionary tales, like you mentioned with Japan. What policymakers should keep in mind when investing right now millions and billions into specific technologies.
Yeah, I think it's an important point in terms of the infrastructure for AI and the extent to which sovereignty is important for infrastructure rollouts, such as building data centers. I think for me, the first cut answer to that is, what type of infrastructure are you focusing on? So are you focusing on chips to train frontier AI models? Or are you focusing on chips that are optimized for inference, running and deploying these models at scale? And so for me, I think based on GPT diffusion theory, countries should optimize for the latter. And sort of that's what should drive some of the infrastructure layout. I'm not as sure, this goes back to the ownership question, I'm not as sure what my stance would be on to what extent Europe needs a sovereign tech stack on the infrastructure layer level. Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions about, is sovereignty located at the level of where the data centers are built, who owns the data centers, or who governs the data centers? And so those would be things that I'd be trying to think through. Yeah, please follow. Yeah.
Maybe also just beyond going the infrastructure layer and the computing infrastructure
Yeah.
layer to run basically GPTs. I think there's also, for example, talks about building a Euro LLM and specifically investing or funding specific technologies.
Yeah.
And so curious to hear your opinions on that, not just the infrastructure, but like whether or not we should.
Yeah, I think that's the type of thing. I think the sovereignty and dependency concerns for me are more salient at the infrastructural level, at the computing hardware level. I'm less concerned about dependency risks when it comes to LLMs, in part because you have, as I was saying earlier, you have diversified supply. So if you're cut off from Claude, you can go to DeepSeek. If you're cut off from DeepSeek, you can go to ChatGPT, or you have all these different large language models, and then you also have third-party integrations of the fundamental large language models. So companies like Perplexity are integrating large language models from all these different countries and all these different companies. So I'm less concerned about the concentration risks there, and so there I don't think there's that much advantage of having like an EU LLM, and there I think it should be sort of all sort of full speed ahead on GPT diffusion.
I think there is a final question over there.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much. Pedro Priege from the Commercial Office of Spanish Embassy. You talked in the beginning about the importance of other academic works on the field of technology and the rise of great powers. And there are other authors like Jared Diamonds on weapons, steel, and germs. And he states the importance of previous social relationships in the great power that develops those technologies. And applied to the diffusion of GPTs, how do you think the present social structures differences between the US and China can affect that diffusion?
Yeah, so as you were saying, a lot of people have tackled this general question. Obviously, the classic works. I think Diamond's story is also very much emphasizing geographic factors too, right? For me, those works are trying to answer a slightly different question. They're trying to answer, why did the West rise ahead of, say, China? Because in the first industrial revolution time period, China was actually the largest economy. But the growth of the West as a whole, they're trying to answer that question. I'm trying to answer, within the West, why did the UK get ahead of the Netherlands and France? And so it's a slightly that's why I think my explanation is a little bit more specific, whereas I don't focus on sort of like these broad social explanations. So other broad social explanations would be like, why did some states develop like inclusive versus extractive institutions, stuff like that. So I am less focused on that broader question and more just focused on why among the already developed and advanced economies, why were there still these significant differences in GPT adoption?
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your next book. Already
Don't put that pressure on me.
But we're wrapping up now. The good news is that the book will be out for sale. You'll be signing, and I think you'll be delighted if you get any advice on where to buy a good chocolate in Brussels.
Yeah, it seems to be you could just like blindfold yourself and walk 2 minutes and you'll find good chocolate. So yeah.
So thank you very much for joining us. If you have questions, maybe you could sort of deal with that bilaterally afterwards. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I wish you a lovely evening.
Thank you, Silke.